This is United States History to 1877. Chapter 13, The Sectional Crisis. In this lecture, you will learn the following information. 1. That California statehood forced Americans to confront the problem of slavery. 2. Religious reformers tried to convince Southerners to give up slavery using morality. 3. Reformers eventually embraced violent resistance to slavery. 4. The Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln emerged as a moderate voice for ending slavery. 5. Abraham Lincoln's election to the presidency caused many Southern states to secede from the country. 6. The Civil War began in 1861. Some of the important terms to know in this unit include the following information. The Haitian Revolution was the first slave revolution that succeeded and was widely ignored and unembraced by the United States. But its example lived on in the minds of slaves that freedom could be won. The Missouri Compromise was the first expansion of slavery west of the Mississippi River, and set up the debate over how slavery should be incorporated into the new growing country. The Democratic Party, which dominated the South, defended slavery in the United States Senate, preventing any debate. And the Whig Party emerged as a counterbalance to the Democratic support for slavery. Frederick Douglass, himself a runaway slave, emerged as a powerful voice in the abolitionist movement and published an international best-selling autobiography of his life. The Wilmot Proviso was an additional amendment to the Declaration of War against Mexico, which said that any territory that was gained would not be used to allow slavery to expand. The Wilmot Proviso failed when slavery was allowed to expand into Texas. The Compromise of 1850 allowed the state of California to come into the Union as a free state. Unlike other compromises, however, with California's entry as a free state, a new slave state was not created, but instead the South was given a stronger fugitive slave law. The Fugitive Slave Act, part of the Compromise of 1850, gave Southerners the right to take their slaves into a free territory and keep them and not allow them to be freed. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin as a way to wake up northern white women and religious reformers to the evils of slavery, which they would not have experienced living in the North. The novel was credited by Abraham Lincoln as having an influence in bringing about the Civil War. Stephen Douglas defeated Abraham Lincoln for a Senate seat in Illinois in 1858. He went on to the United States Senate to propose the use of popular sovereignty, or voting, in order to allow new territories to determine for themselves if they would become free or slave states. Popular sovereignty was used in the Kansas-Nebraska Act to allow the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska to vote on whether to be free or slave. This led to Bleeding Kansas, when, as Kansas elected to become a slave state, abolitionists in the state, among them John Brown, went on a violent rampage against pro-slavery Kansas. The debate over slavery in the United States Senate broke into violence when Charles Sumner brutally beat another member of Congress over the debate about slavery, showing that the debate was no longer one that could be conducted without violent eruptions. In short, it represents the end of democracy and compromise over slavery. The Republican Party was founded upon the belief that slavery should end, and the South saw it as a direct threat to its embrace of slavery. The case of Scott v. Sanford, also known as the Dred Scott case, was a very important Supreme Court case that declared that African Americans would never be citizens of the United States and that slaves would always be considered the property of their masters. John Brown, who had sparked the violence in Kansas over the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the expansion of slavery in that territory, attempted to lead a slave revolt at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He was captured and executed. The election of 1860 saw Abraham Lincoln elected to the White House and the immediate secession of at least 8 states from the South. Slavery's expansion created problems for the United States from the very beginning. Northerners felt that slavery suppressed wages and stole land needed for poor white Americans to achieve independence. Southerners feared that if slavery didn't expand, abolitionists would grow in power and slaves might rise up in a race war. When Missouri joined the Union in 1821, it exposed a deep divide over the question of slavery. North and South, pro-slavery and abolitionist forces voiced strong, uncompromising viewpoints on the question of slavery. Political parties argued in favor of white supremacy, helping to avoid the issue of slavery. This map shows the slave population of the southern states that was compiled for the census of 1860, showing the widespread use of slavery and its essential importance to the economy of the American South. As a result, Democrats and Whigs supported rules that forbade any discussion of slavery in Congress. Texas independence and statehood shattered the unity and silence on this issue, however, when both Texas and Florida entered the Union as slave states. Abolitionists feared that Manifest Destiny was overtaking the anti-slavery debate. Growth seemed more important, and the Fugitive Slave Act added insult to injury, making anyone in the North liable if they helped runaway slaves. Now, everyone was involved in the inhumanity of slavery, regardless of their views on the subject. The rising celebrity of Frederick Douglass fueled the controversy. A runaway slave himself, Douglass wrote books and gave speeches to large audiences. Douglass's powerful skills as a speaker and writer led many to believe the evils of slavery had gone on too long and were anti-American in their basis and morality. His calls for the end of slavery made many white Americans confront the issue for the first time. Others, like Harriet Tubman, also a runaway slave, helped slaves to escape on the Underground Railroad, a series of safe houses and hiding spots that slaves could use to travel from the South through the North to freedom in Canada. Pro-slavery forces had powerful allies in the United States government, like President James K. Polk, seen here on the right, or John C. Calhoun, a powerful senator from South Carolina and a former vice president himself, seen here on the left. When war with Mexico broke out in 1846, anti-slavery politicians tried to limit any land gained during the war from adding to the growth of slavery, but ultimately they failed to prevent slavery from expanding into the new territories. By 1850, California wanted admission as a free state. To balance the concerns of pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, a new compromise was needed because California would fall south of the previous line created by the Missouri Compromise. Henry Clay proposed the Compromise of 1850. The compromise tried to offer something to everyone, but ultimately made the sectional crisis only worse. In the compromise, California would become a free state, breaking the boundary line set by the Missouri Compromise. To satisfy Southerners, a new, stronger fugitive slave law was added. This new Fugitive Slave Act gave Southerners the right to take their slaves into free states, and that those slaves would not be considered free as they had before. Furthermore, the law also forced Northerners to help hunt down any runaway slave, and Northerners who did not could be fined or imprisoned for not participating in slavery. Many Northerners became convinced that slave owners had taken control of Washington, D.C. for their own purposes. Let's pause for a moment now to test our understanding of the information presented to this point by examining this question. This is an accept question, one of the more difficult types of multiple choice questions you might encounter. It's difficult because it asks you to find the wrong answer rather than the right answer. In this, be careful. The question asks, the Missouri Compromise did all of the following except A. Admit Maine as a free state. B. Admit Missouri as a slave state. C. Establish the 3630 dividing line for future state admissions. Or D. Propose popular sovereignty as the determination of whether states would have slavery. The correct answer for this question would be D, which we could determine by process of elimination, remembering that the Missouri Compromise did allow Maine to be a free state, and did allow Missouri to be a slave state, and it also created the dividing line for future states to be considered slave or free by using the 3630 dividing line. One example of the unpopularity of slavery was the best-selling novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin, which quickly became the most widely read book in North America, selling second only to the Bible. The book reveals that Americans in the North were finally interested in learning more about the evils of slavery, and the book was written by a woman, which was rather unusual at this time in history. The book helped to move anti-slavery into everyday conversation for many Northerners who had, until this point, turned a blind eye to slavery, arguing that they did not own slaves, and therefore it was not something they should concern themselves with. If Southerners would own slaves, that was their problem, many felt. But this book changed their minds and made them embrace abolition. While attacking slavery, however, the book also reinforced many racist stereotypes about African Americans that would continue to follow for many years to come. Let's take another moment now to test our memory and retention of the information that you read about and listened to in this lecture. In this question, we have another accept challenge. So we want to be careful because these are often the most difficult questions. They ask us to find what's wrong rather than what's right, and that makes it tricky. The question in this case is about Uncle Tom's Cabin. The question reads, all of the following are true about Uncle Tom's Cabin, except A. It was the most widely purchased book in the 19th century. B. It helped move anti-slavery into public conversation in the North. C. It reinforced many racist stereotypes. And D. It was written by a woman. The answer is A. It was the most widely purchased book in the 19th century is not true, because we know the Bible was the most widely purchased book in the 19th century. Uncle Tom's Cabin was second to the Bible in popularity, making it an international blockbuster bestseller. By 1853, The Kansas-Nebraska Territory was ready for statehood. Congress proposed allowing the white people of the area to vote on whether it should become slave or free. Debates in Congress predicted the violence that was soon to follow. In 1855, a group of Americans calling themselves the Know Nothing Party formed to oppose German and Irish immigration. Another new party formed in 1854 to oppose slavery, called the Republican Party. These two new political parties showed the division over the debates surrounding slavery, as different groups emerged to argue different perspectives that focused on immigration and slavery independently of one another, as agreement over the issue was no longer possible for many Americans. The new political parties only added to a growing tension over the political debate around slavery. Following an explosive speech before Congress, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts was violently beaten with a cane by Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina on the floor of the United States Senate. Brooks nearly killed Sumner in front of a large crowd of senators. Later, Preston Brooks was congratulated by Southern politicians for defending his honor and the honor of all Southern slave owners. Violence in Washington was coupled with violence in Kansas, when radical abolitionist John Brown murdered several pro-slavery Kansans in Lawrence, Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, as the killings were called, loomed largely over the 1856 election, as slavery was now a full-blown national crisis. In that same year, the Supreme Court added to the crisis when it decided the case of Dred Scott v. Sanford. The Dred Scott decision determined that slaves should remain the property of their owners even when they entered a free territory anywhere in the United States, and that African Americans could not ever be citizens of the United States. This decision had broad impact and moved the country much closer to the Civil War. Essentially, it declared that slavery existed everywhere, north, south, and west, slave state or free, and even free African Americans could be returned to slavery as they had no rights under the law. John Brown, fresh from his actions in Kansas, moved east and planned new violence. He gathered supporters and planned to attack Harper's Ferry, Virginia, a federal arsenal, where he would capture the weapons stored there and lead a slave revolt. The plan unfolded October 16th through the 18th, 1858. Brown and his men were captured by Robert E. Lee, a general in the Union Army at this time, but soon who would go on to lead the Confederate forces in the Civil War. Many of Brown's men were killed, including his two sons. John Brown was convicted of sedition and treason. At his trial, he claimed he would have been considered a hero if he had been fighting for the wealthy and the powerful. But because he fought for the powerless and the slave, he was to be killed. Brown also said he believed firmly that only bloodshed could cleanse the nation of its crimes against God. Northerners saw John Brown as a hero, while Southerners considered him a madman. The election of 1860 would be a national debate on these different viewpoints over slavery. Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860, the first Republican to win the White House. Lincoln gained only 40% of the popular vote and got no Southern votes in the Electoral College. On December 20th, just weeks after the election, South Carolina declared it was leaving the Union, or seceding. While many Southerners would claim the reason for leaving was the desire for states' rights, the Declaration of Immediate Causes, a document put forth by the Southern Confederacy at the time, listed the absence of federal power to control attacks on slavery as the reason for the new nation to be born. The desire for more centralized power and the desire for more states' rights is a contradiction. In February, rebels had formed the Confederate States of America, drafting a constitution that declared their intention to be white supremacy and the protection of slavery. The Confederacy named Jefferson Davis as their new president. Weeks after Abraham Lincoln's inauguration, where he called for friendship among all states, rebels attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Within a day, Abraham Lincoln would call for 75,000 volunteers from the North to crush the rebellion. The Civil War had begun. In this lecture, you learned the following information. 1. California statehood forced Americans to confront the problem of slavery. 2. Religious reformers tried to convince Southerners to give up slavery. And 3. Reformers embraced violent resistance to slavery. 4. Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln emerged as a moderate voice for ending slavery. 5. Abraham Lincoln's election caused many Southern states to secede. And 6. The Civil War begins in 1861. This has been United States History to 1877, Chapter 13, The Sectional Crisis. Created with work from the American Yop, an open-source U.S. history textbook published by Stanford University, edited by Joseph Locke and Ben Wright, with narration and comments by myself, Tyler Rust, for History Dojo. For more materials related to this course and other articles related to history, go to historydojo.blog.